Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Rosalie Olmsted. I am WESIS Executive Assistant. It is an honor to have you all here today with WESIS strategic partner Sandia National Laboratories. But before we get started, I'd like to give you a quick overview of the WESIS organization. We often go by our acronym WESIS because that is exactly what we are, a global cyber sisterhood. WESIS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. Our community is made up of over 10,000 members in over 99 countries. We have 70 professional affiliates and 299 student chapters around the world. We offer a variety of initiatives and skills development programs, including our annual conference, which is coming up from April 2nd through the 5th in Dallas, Texas. Our leadership series, Job Board Plus Plus, Speakers Bureau, Mentor Mentee Program, and so much more. We owe all of our wonderful initiatives and programs to our strategic partners who fund us year round. Specifically, we'd like to thank our Tier 1 strategic partners being Akamai, Amazon, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon's University's Software Engineering Institute, Cisco, Ford, Google, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, Optum, Sandia National Laboratories, and SentinelOne. Please do not forget to ask your questions throughout the webinar today. If you have a question, to drop it in the question box below, and if time permits, we will get to them at the end of the webinar during our Q&A session. And lastly, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to the WESIS newsletter on any upcoming events and including our upcoming webinars. You can find it at wesis.org in the upper right-hand corner. And with that, I'll be turning it over to Dr. Ruby Booth with Sandia National Laboratories.
Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here. I am a WESIS alum myself. I went to WESIS conferences when I was a student and made some wonderful contacts and had great experiences. So it is a great delight to be working for an organization that I love, that is a WESIS sponsor, and to be able to talk to all of you today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity risk analysis, systems of systems, and sort of how that ties into national security work. And I do work for Sandia National Labs, but I don't speak for the company. The content that I am teaching you today or talking about with you today, is they're my own views. So if I say something kooky, it's not the U.S. government saying it. Next slide, please. Oh, I can do the slides. Never mind. So we're going to talk a little bit about risk fundamentals. We're going to talk about analytic approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's so special about cyber, like why does cyber matter, and then critical infrastructure and what to do about it. I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Jason Reinhardt, who works at Purdue University and Sandia National Labs. He, as part of his work with DHS, CISA's National Risk Management Center, made some of these slides and things, and so I want to definitely give them credit where credit's due. He's been a big risk mentor for me. So when we talk about risk, informally we say, oh, that's risky, right? But what does that mean in sort of a more technical sense? We split risk out into three things that we look at. So we look at basically risk is the potential for something that you don't want to happen. So it can be anything from the terrible hurricanes that we've been experiencing recently to, the risk of, say, you dropping your phone and breaking it, to the risk of a cyber attack that takes out electricity to a town. So we think about it in terms of how likely it is and how consequential it is. So we really want to manage risks that have, like, the most important risks to manage are the ones that have high likelihood and high consequence. So you sort of map likelihood on a little axis and you map consequence on an axis. You sort of want to manage up here. We split likelihood into two pieces: the likelihood of a threat existing and the likelihood of a vulnerability existing. A threat is any kind of thing, it can be natural, it could be man-made, anything that happens that has the potential to exploit a vulnerability to cause a consequence. So a threat could be a hurricane, it could be a hacker, It could be our own clumsiness in dropping the phone. Threats are not necessarily malevolent, but they do cause adverse consequences when you move into this vulnerability space. A vulnerability is anything that allows, like anything that renders you susceptible to a threat. And then the consequences are the bad things that happen. Likelihood is the chance of the things happening. So when we think about threat, vulnerability, and consequence, we are examining this in terms of often a mathematical formula, right? The like threat, on some kind of scale times the likelihood, vulnerability on some kind of scale times the likelihood, and then what the consequences would be if it happened. And you multiply all those together, and then it gives you some kind of specific number, and you can say, okay, it's worth this much money to mitigate against that threat. Um, when we're doing security risk, and specifically national security risk, one of the things that's a little different than how you might do this kind of work in other contexts is the consequences that we care about. So if you go work for a company, right, and you say, okay, I'm going to analyze your cyber risk, you're probably going to be thinking about that in terms of economic impacts. So the impacts that arise from the the failure of a system. So let's say you can't accept money, right? Or let's say you have to replace a computer, right? Those are economic impacts. But when we're looking at national security spaces, so Sandia is a national lab and we advise the government on a lot of different things. We're also one of the nuclear labs. And so we make we both make parts of nuclear weapons and then we integrate all those parts together to make sure that the nuclear stockpile is safe. And so we care a lot about safety and security. And so a lot of times, if something goes wrong in our systems or something goes wrong that we're being asked to advise about, it's not just economic consequences. People, could be hurt, they could die. And there's also potential environmental impacts. So, like if you think about something, recently, like the hurricanes that we've seen, environmental impacts could be, the change in the soil landscape and things like that. It could also be floods have a bad habit of spreading toxic chemicals around. Toxic chemicals that might have been contained may come out and get washed away. Their containers break, and then now there's toxic chemical in the environment. And then societal impacts. In particular, here I'm talking about things like public trust. Sometimes when things go wrong, it changes how we think and feel about our government, about the providers of something. Just it changes our view. So we have to think about all those kinds of consequences. So let's dive into those threat, vulnerability, and consequence a little bit. So um, threat analysis looks at how likely it is that the scenario will be credibly attempted, which means like how likely is it that this threat will have the ability to will want to and will occur. So you can think about that from a human perspective in terms of like, let's say I'm a cyber criminal, right? Like I might want your money, and I might have the skills to go exploit a vulnerability to get your money. That would be, so the likelihood of that coming together would be how we would think about threat from a man-made sort of standpoint. But when we think about something like natural disasters, like a landslide or a flood, we might think about it in terms of like propensity or susceptibility, right? Like, are the conditions correct? So, is there a high pressure, a low pressure system? What's the temperature of the water, that kind of thing? And then is there, how might it move? So, for example, is it the tendency of these kind of hurricanes to go in this kind of direction? And so a lot of times we start our analysis with T, although I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can do analysis even if you don't know the specific threat. For vulnerability, you're looking at how likely it is that if that adversary or hazard's another thing that term that we use for threat. Has a tendency to cover things like, you know, the whole bundle, right? So the flood and the adversary and all those things. But anyway, so a hazard, how probable is it when we're looking at vulnerability? How probable is it that you would be susceptible to that threat? So a good way of thinking about this is if you live on the coast, you are probably more vulnerable to hurricanes than if you live inland in the mountains. It's not a perfect model, right? We're talking about likelihoods. So we did see recently that like it was a low likelihood that that vulnerability was going to come into play in the Appalachian Mountains, but it did. So again, these are all likelihoods. You're not going to get a perfect predictive outcome out of risk analysis, but it helps people make choices. Um, Another example of sort of a vulnerability that you can sometimes we avoid threats, we avoid risk by eliminating a vulnerability. So, for example, if I don't use a cell phone, then I can't drop it. But a lot of times we don't really have the option to just avoid. The analytic challenge for vulnerability is just figuring out all the ways that you can be susceptible to a threat, which in some cases is fairly easy, like with flood. And in some cases, like with cyber, where the threat changes really quickly, it can be quite challenging. With consequence, there are a number of challenges, and I've spent a lot of my career looking at consequences. One, there is just all the different types of consequences that we've talked about. There are some others that you could consider, things like national security consequences or reputational damage, like those kinds of things. If a company gets breached, maybe do we not trust them as much? If like if there's an oil spill because of a shipping accident, you might not want to buy from them. So there's just kind of reputational harms. I don't usually deal with reputational harm, but it is a kind we might calculate. The other thing that's really tricky about consequence is what we call consequence cascades, which is that idea that like, okay, the simplest example of this is a dam fails. A dam fails, the direct impact of that, like the direct consequence is water floods out, right? That's the simplest, most direct consequence. But then that water hits, let's say, a power station. Well, now we have a cascading consequence, which is that the power goes out. Now, because the power goes out, we might have other consequences. And so, you can keep following that line down. And that's actually a pretty sophisticated kind of research and a kind of research we have to do a lot for the federal government because they have to respond not just to that first thing. A lot of times the first thing is not even the government's responsibility. Like the first thing might be the responsibility of the company that manages that dam or the state that manages that dam. But once the consequences continue to cascade, you can wind up with a situation that's quite dire and where the federal government needs to intervene. So there are different ways that we can approach these analysis. We really start with a lot of my job is just framing and scoping. A lot of my job is saying, hey, you might want to think about this in this way, structuring the conversation, saying these are the factors, this is sort of the spread. These are the kinds of threats you're going to consider. These are the kinds of vulnerabilities that are in scope for you. These are the kinds of consequences you might want to think about, and here are some ways that we do that. The next thing you might do is something called relative risk assessments. You would generally use those to say, like, hey, I said earlier that like you want to look at the threats on this part of the map. A lot of times you do that by just having subject matter experts say, you ask them, you say, is this more likely than that? Is this more consequential than that? And you position them. Sometimes you even use post-it notes to just position them in a space. Next, you can get to scoring and ranking, so you can have a more systematic process. They're not just comparing the threats to each other, but they're comparing the threats against some kind of rubric. So, like, I think this is likely to happen once a second, once a minute, once a day, once a week, once a month, once a year, and you sort of sort them that way. And then I expect there to be no loss of life. I expect some people to get, a few people to get injured. I expect people to get injured and maybe some people to die. And so on. You can do that with financial, you can do it with anything. And so then that gives you sort of a relative scoring or ranking. And then we get into these probabilistic approaches. And the probabilistic approaches I use least often, although I do have colleagues that do like whole Bayesian analysis nets where you basically are able to assign real numbers. Down here, in the like national risk sector management and then on down to the reactor safety. A lot of times when we have like really good physics models, we can do that kind of analysis. And then modeling and simulation. Some of you may work in that area. For modeling and simulation, basically, you're making a very accurate model of the system. That's easier for smaller, more constrained systems, harder for bigger, more amorphous systems. Like, I do a lot of work in critical infrastructure, and we don't even know how many critical infrastructure companies are in America, let alone being able to model how they all interact. We think of these on a spectrum. So from qualitative, where all you have a lot of information about the context, but maybe you don't have like the perfect model or a lot of sort of data points, over to quantitative. Both of them are perfectly valid types of method. If you're in any sort of research design classes, or if you do research out in the world, because I know that WESIS now covers a wide array, so you're not just students, there's professionals in this call as well. You can There can be rigorous research in any space from qualitative to quantitative. And in fact, what often happens is it's sort of a cycle. You start with qualitative, figure out what the questions are, model the most important questions. That gives you edge cases and sort of points of curiosity. You go back to figure out why those act the way they do, and then you keep going. So I tend to do a lot of qualitative research, which is why I have colleagues like Dr. Jason Reinhardt who do quantitative research, so we can kind of balance each other out. Okay, so I've talked a good bit about risk analysis, but I know that you want to hear about cyber, because WESIS is a cyber organization, cyber security, and so here are some things about cyber that are different. First of all, cyberspace is a domain of constant contact. What do I mean by that? In, for instance, naval combat or naval security, right? We have all this territory that we call international waters that nobody owns. You can be there, you can hang out, it's fine. Um, Cyberspace, if you're not in your system, you're in someone else's. Attribution of attacks is difficult, so it's like even hard to know who is in your system or how long. How long do you think? Um, and so detection of attacks and intrusions is often delayed. How long do you think? Just I want you to think to yourself, how long does it usually take before an attack, somebody in your system is detected? Just think about that and come up with a number. The answer is 8 months. That's a long time to have attackers in our system, but a lot of times people come in, they're doing small things, they're not detected, they're waiting, they're maybe funneling data back out, it's not caught. 8 months is a long time. Cross-domain deterrence, so this is a concept that we work with. Deterrence is when you're trying to dissuade your adversary from doing something that you don't want them to do, by saying, if you do that, I will um, punish you, or by making it really hard for them to do so, it's not worth it. And when we do that in the cyber domain, we don't really know what the consequences are. So we don't know if it's going to be escalatory or not. We know like this cyber attack is going to do this thing, or at least we should know, have some sense of what it's going to do, but we don't necessarily know how our adversaries are going to react. The US is more vulnerable in cyber than other countries, not because we have crappy cyber defenders. We have really good cyber defenders, but we don't have enough of them. And we put cyber in more things. I mean, we are more online than almost any other country on earth, and we put cyber in. By cyber, I mean we put digital systems, we put cyber enabled, sort of web enabled, Bluetooth enabled systems in all kinds of parts of our critical infrastructure, much more quickly than other nations did. If you do catch a bad guy in cyber, we don't really know what to do about it. Like, if you call, let's say you caught somebody in your network, right? You're like, somebody's in there right now, and I can see them. Do you call the cops? Do you call the FBI? Do you call the Department of Homeland Security? Who do you call? And then if that person, going into international norms, if that person is in some other country, like how do they get arrested? Do they get arrested? Some countries don't have the same view of cybercrime that we do. So it's really, really challenging. Cyber is an offensive capability, so cyber weapons are something that we don't really the effects. We're worried about like them getting sort of loose, viruses getting loose. Um, it's really hard to tell whether somebody from like my level, when you're dealing with national security, it's really hard to tell whether somebody's in your network because they intend to do it harm or because they're just snooping around. Snooping around is a much less of a big deal than like actively looking to break stuff. There's also just a lot of things can change very quickly with cyber, and that makes it hard to defend against, both at like an enterprise level and at a national security level. And then there's just a lot of tension around like whether or not you can, like whether or not you should share and what you should share between companies. This comes up because they don't want to give up proprietary information, but then also at a national level, right? Like if I see a vulnerability, do I tell everybody? Or do I keep that a secret and maybe try to use it? That's a question that the government has to decide. But then also like, do, who and when do we share security information with is just challenging. There's not norms for that yet, or at least not very well established ones. So generally in national security work, when we're working with cyber, there are three things that we want. We want the continued absence of cyber attacks that constitute a use of force. That's a very big, funky phrase. But basically, what we mean is we don't want a cyber war. We don't want anybody to do anything. We call it no cyber Pearl Harbor, but basically, we don't want some cyber incident that incites some big war. We don't want that. I worry about that happening by accident, where somebody doesn't necessarily know where our red lines are or where an attack gets out and they didn't mean it to, and then suddenly we're at war and nobody meant us to be. The other thing that we're trying to avoid is death by a thousand cuts, which is this idea that like a lot of times people just poke at the systems, poke it. You know, we do a little bit over here, do a little bit over there. It's not enough to like get super angry about. It's not enough to go to war about, but it can have a negative impact on our national security. So we want to get rid of those. We want to make our systems either secure enough, reducing vulnerabilities, right, or resilient enough, reducing consequences, so that these death by a thousand cuts things don't change our strategic position. And then we want global strategic stability. We want the world to keep rocking along without major wars. This is this is a slide I've used many times, and it's interesting to use it now because in the 5 years that I've been working and talking about global cyber deterrence, we do have more wars than we used to, and some of them do involve cyber publicly reported cyber elements. And so, you know, it is interesting to think about global strategic stability right now when we have wars in several parts of the world. One of the things that is concerning if you're coming from like a US security perspective, and I understand folks may be called in from other countries, or you may be working in the US and have citizenship in other countries, but from like a US specific perspective, we are really worried about the fact that our ability to defend is not as good as it needs to be. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that it's just way easy to attack in cyber than it is to defend. The sort of common phrase is that uh, attackers only have to get lucky once, defenders have to get lucky every day, every minute of every day for every system. And that's really true. So, you know, once somebody gets into your system, it's a lot easier for them to do harm. And all they have to do is find a single entry. They have to do one social engineering attack to get in, and then they can start moving around. So it's really, really challenging. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about myths because I think wherever you are in your career, there are some things to keep in mind. I see a lot of mistakes made when thinking about cyber, and so I'm going to share these with you so that you don't make them. One, some people believe you cannot kill people with cyber attacks, and that is just not true. Cyber attacks to critical infrastructure, to healthcare organizations, power, water, all these things can kill people, not to mention medical devices and things like that. So when you are pursuing a career in cybersecurity defense, um, that can save lives. And in fact, we've seen incidents where even sort of fairly banal attacks like ransomware have shut down hospital systems. This happened in the UK. And they did a calculation, and we know that it increased the mortality rate in the area around that hospital by approximately 10 lives. I can't point to a person and say, Steve, Steve died because of that ransomware attack, but we know what the general rates of sort of success are with surgery, and we know that the time to treatment is a big factor, and we know that this increased the time to treatment for many, many patients. So even though that ransomware didn't seem to the people who were sending it out maybe like it was potentially deadly, they used it on a healthcare system and people died, or at least had much worse outcomes. Another thing is that cyber deterrence isn't possible or that cyber deterrence is working. This is, again, I'm going to use that phrase deterrence, but basically, like, either we can't stop folks from attacking us or nobody's attacking us. And the reason we have these sort of very different views is that it depends on whether or not you count cyber crime and these sort of low level cyber attacks. The fact is that we think cyber deterrence probably functions differently above and below like that level of like, oh, we're going to war over this. And so, so it's really important that that we have clarity about like what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber deterrence. Um, 1 second. I'm so sorry. I believed that I was plugged in, but my battery is giving me a message. So hold for just a moment. All right, everyone. Well, wish me luck. I I'm having a little bit of an issue with these plugs not working. All right. Okay. Apologies. So, what's so special about critical infrastructure is our next area. So, the critical infrastructure is really complicated because it's susceptible to a lot of hazards, including cyber attacks and supply chain vulnerabilities and all the natural disasters that we're experiencing. On top of that, it is really complicated. So there is a challenge of risk analysis at scale. The idea that all of these things connect, right? So we normally think about who, like who is running the critical infrastructure, and then we look at how they're running it. So how are they doing it? Like what do they have that creates that critical infrastructure? But now we're adding in this sort of third area, which is what is the actual function that that's performing? And that does help us do the analysis, but at the end of the day, if you look at this little model, communications, for example, now relies on information technology. It relies on electricity, so it relies on the dams. It relies on the transport systems to get people to work. All of these things are interrelated. And so that makes it hard to do that analysis. The way that we deal with that is by we break that verb, the what are they doing, down into these subsets. So we say, okay, let's say transport materials by pipeline. That was one that came, we had some issues with a couple of years ago with gasoline pipelines, right? So you go, okay, we're going to transport something by pipeline. We're going to transport liquid. That liquid is going to be gasoline. And then we're going to do that by having all these pipes, and we're going to have pump stations. And so by breaking that down, we can sort of say, okay, these threats could attack these areas with this sort of component. Like there could be this kind of vulnerability. But that's not really enough. It's still a very big system, a very challenging system. And so what we wind up doing is at the high level, we look at the situation and we say, do I really need to know about the threat? So is the threat really giving me information that I need, or are or can I skip that and go to the vulnerability and just say, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that might lead to that outcome. And then don't need either, then we can just skip straight to consequence and say, okay, that's my pinch point. I'm going to care about if this particular thing goes out. So that's kind of a fuzzy thing to talk about. Let me give an example. The example of a pinch point is when a dam fails, for instance. I don't care why the dam failed. When I'm doing emergency response. Later, if I'm building a new dam or I'm replacing the dam, I'm going to care why that dam failed. But right now, the dam has failed. I don't care why. As a national response, like I need to know what the water's going to do, who's going to be in line of the damage. Like, are there electrical substations that are going to go out? What are the nearest hospitals that people are going to go to? Like when you're thinking about, for instance, Helene, right, and the horrible, catastrophic damage that's happened in the Carolinas and in Appalachia more generally, right? Like a hurricane has hit. That's my pinch point. So then I ask my decision maker, like, who's my decision maker? What can they control? Let's say my decision maker is FEMA, right? Okay, so you need to know what materials to bring, what help to accept, what kinds of, where to deploy, all of those things. So then I say, okay, I'm going to look at the consequences of that having happened. And we're going to run an analysis of all the different kinds of consequences. I'm going to make those scenarios as clear as I can. I'm going to estimate the consequences. And then I'm going to say, okay, the hardest hit area is likely to be here in terms of health and loss of life. So you need to deploy there. And I report those results back in a way that the decision maker can understand. And that's really what we do every day. So we do it for lots of different kinds of things. I tend to do it for cyber because I have a cyber background. It's incredibly rewarding work. Um, I do a lot of advanced planning. So before the accident happens, before the terrible thing occurs, so that we can say, this is the plan that you may want to make. The later, sort of the more responsive analysis, though, is something we're called in to do. And so sometimes when something bad happens, I get a phone call and it is, this bad thing has happened. How do we respond? Or we see this threat coming on the horizon. What do we need to shore up to protect against it? Verification and validation is important when we're doing work with these kinds of stakes. So basically, when I do an analysis, I send it out. I send people out to I send it out to people to check its robustness to make sure I haven't made any crazy assumptions and to make sure that it matches reality. So it's not just me sitting in a room. It's not even just me and my team sitting in a room. We ask other people for help to make sure that we do a good job. And that's all I've got in terms of slides. So I think there might be some questions in the chat. Oh, I can't hear you.
Presentation. Sorry for that slight delay getting back in.
Oh,
So we do have a couple questions and I will just get right to it. So during this time, everyone, please feel free to submit any questions you may have for Dr. Booth. This will be a great opportunity for us to go through the Q&A. So do you have any advice on getting a security clearance without employer assistance? Because that I know has been a few questions we've been asked in the last few months, and I'm eager for our viewers to get that answer for you.
the short answer is you can't. You have to have a sponsor for security clearance. Now, there's a broader sort of question there, which is one, can you do this work without security clearance? And a lot of the work that I do is unclassified. You can. Um, but the other thing is different kinds of employers can hold security clearances. So some universities have relationships with departments such that they hold clearances. Sometimes an organization, if you're working as a contractor, that organization will put you up for a clearance. You can do this kind of work without having a clearance, but it is true that to work, for instance, for my specific organization, you do have to go through that process. The other thing is that I will say more and more organizations are having to do this kind of risk analysis, particularly with the rise of quantum. Sorry, I was saying in the chat. Sorry, with the rise of climate change. And so even if you are someone who for some reason cannot get a clearance, for example, if it can be challenging for people from certain nations, although not Not impossible. I definitely have colleagues who are from who are from or have families from nations that you might think you wouldn't be able to get cleared, but they go through the process and they can. But you know, there's a lot of restrictions still around things that might be legal in your state. For instance, marijuana use is still a blocker for clearance, even though it's fully legal in lots of places. And so I will say, if a clearance is an obstacle for you for any reason, there's still a lot of very impactful cyber risk analysis work that you can do.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mhm.
Dr. Booth, we've gotten a lot of questions about can I share your slides after this presentation? So
Yes,
I
you're welcome to have them. Yeah.
perfect. Everyone watching, I will be able to attach them within 15 minutes of the slides of the webinar finishing. So keep an eye on it for this afternoon, and I will make sure that they are available. So next question is, how do you get a non-cyber, non-IT regular users to care about the risks their systems present? I frequently work with folks who don't understand or think about cyber, and they think that cyber is trying to stop them from doing their job. Great
Yeah, so
question.
that's a great question, and it's one that I've actually done quite a bit of work on. Because my background before I came to national security cyber analysis was actually in human motivation and behavior. So I am not a programmer. And this is something that I want to really foot stomp for the group. You do not have to be a coder to get into cybersecurity. There's so many different kinds of careers. My specialization is in why people do what they do. And I would say that in general, when you are having a problem where you feel like your users are not taking cyber seriously enough, there's a couple of issues that may come up. One is there may just be a communication problem. You may not have enough cyber awareness in your organization. Um, but the other one, and I think this is more common, is that you may not be aligning your cyber security and cyber sort of defense messaging to the values of the people. There's a wonderful study that I cite all the time.
Mm,
It is a study of nurses and doctors in an emergency room who were just violating left and right all the cybersecurity policies. And when finally, like a human factors person came in and did a study, they found out that the reason that that was happening was because the values of those nurses was patient care. So their number one priority was speed of patient care. And the system to log out and log back in took like a minute. You know, it's a medical system, it's relatively old, they're kind of clunky a lot of times.
yeah.
That was interfering with their ability to perform their job. And so you really have to, if you're consistently seeing that problem, I would recommend doing some surveys, doing some focus groups, getting in there and having the conversation to figure out, because most people don't want a security incident. So why is the value not aligning?
That's Yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind who you're talking to and the audience and adjusting that. So that I really enjoyed that answer. Um, I saw in the news yesterday that quantum computers, quantum attack, have been used to crack RSA and AES. What are your thoughts on how we can protect ourselves and harden our defenses against quantum computing threats and risks?
Yeah, so quantum computing is a big question mark. And there's sort of this perspective that whoever gets to it first is going to be the winner. I think that's probably not true. I mean, it may be that we're going to have a different perspective about privacy, not personal privacy, which we've already had to adapt to, right? But like national privacy, like what is it if if I if we go back to having a hard time keeping secrets? Are we going to have to transmit the information differently? Are we going to have to store it differently? Like that's a big question. I don't have an answer for it yet. I will say that a lot of very smart people are thinking about that problem, but it's tricky.
That is a big question.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any further thoughts on the increasing risks coming from third party and supply chain attacks?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So, I do some supply chain risk analysis, and I've done some work in various capacities on that. I think the first thing that I mean, SBOM, so software bill of materials and things like that will help a little. But one of the things is we just have to get a lot more sophisticated about our risk analysis around supply chain. Right now, we're looking at things like foreign ownership, control, and influence, which is a terrible proxy for security. Just because something comes from, I'm just going to pick a commonly used example, right? Just because something comes from China doesn't mean it's not safe. And just because it comes from the US doesn't mean it is. Things can have security flaws, people can be bribed, there's a lot of reasons. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is better track those relationships. I do a lot of work with node databases, which allow sort of us to track the relationships between. This is also, and I hate to say it, this is also potentially one of the good uses for blockchain. I know that there was like this time where we thought we could just sprinkle blockchain on everything, but this actually might be a case where it can be really beneficial.
Um, this person really enjoyed your presentation. And from your work, what are some of the major cyber threats that you see to critical infrastructure in present times? And what areas within critical infrastructure do you see as being more vulnerable?
So I'm gonna be cautious about that just because of where I work, but I will say because I don't want to say
Sure.
Sandia National Lab says this, even though it's just me talking.
Yep.
But I will say that I think there are a couple of things. One is the pipeline issue. We don't have enough cybersecurity professionals, and that means that the people who can spend the most money have the best security. And a lot of times, critical
Mhm.
infrastructure are actually relatively small shops. It's a municipal, like I come from Memphis, Tennessee. Our power is run out of like MLG&W, which is a municipally owned utility. They probably don't have as much money to pay for cybersecurity experts as Google does. So, I think that's a problem. I think also just looking back at the decisions that we made in the 90s and early 2000s when we weren't really as sensitive to these security problems is probably a good second step.
Thank you for that. And then, do you have any examples, and you might not be able to comment on this, of international investigations after having a breach?
I do not have any examples of that I could offer.
Okay. And then this is going to change directions a little bit, but for someone who went to a boot camp and has, an ISO 2 certification in CompTIA Security Plus, what do you think the best way for them to improve themselves more in gaining to be able to enter the cybersecurity world? I get this question a lot, so I think,
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. One is there's a website called CyberSeek, which is done out of NIST. I think that's the right name. Um, they they have I'm a huge fan of NIST. NIST is National Institute for Standards and Technology, but they've really stepped up in the cyber area. They do a lot of standards and frameworks, but they have an entire thrust that's around education and pipeline development and careers. On that site, you can find specific mappings for what to do next, what kind of certifications might be beneficial based on exactly the job you want or the job category that you want. It'll explain what all the job categories are so that you can kind of see where you fit. And then it will also, if you're in a particular area, it'll show you what kind of open jobs they have. So it's an incredible resource. In addition, I would say don't undersell the work you've already done. There's a huge shortage in this field. I would very strongly recommend attending things like WESIS networking events, join your local chapter. A lot of times folks get into cybersecurity because they come in with these those are good certifications. I'm not going to call them entry level, but they come in with a few certifications, and then they get a lot of on the job experience. So yeah, I would say networking is a big point. And I want to make a quick point about networking because when I was young, I thought it was really creepy. And what I've realized is networking is essentially just friend making for your career, right? Like you're just it is not weird or creepy to be like, "Hey, I do this thing. You are also interested in this thing. Let's stay in contact so that we can see if there's areas of benefit." It's good to keep that separate from like other kinds of social engagements, but there's nothing weird or wrong about this. One of the questions that folks ask, like, can I friend you on LinkedIn? Like, I am happy to be a connection. I am happy to answer questions. And that's just a normal part. That is networking, and that is okay. It's healthy and good.
and it's great. And I honestly, conferences as well. Like I attend a lot of local conferences in Pittsburgh that are geared towards cybersecurity. And I feel like that is where I've made so many connections in the
Mhm.
industry. And you see a lot of the similar faces if you do the local
Yeah.
ones. And it's great for the networking side. I feel like I've made just incredible connections and being able to find what are you interested in and how can I help, or the same vice versa. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to agree and add my 2 cents to that one.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing a lot of thank you regarding sharing that website because yes, CyberSeek is spectacular and being
So
able
good.
to because career pathways. I think what not everyone knows is there's so many pathways into cybersecurity. And I mean, you even stated your background was not cybersecurity initially. And I think that's important to be able to know that what you bring to the table is very valuable and there are a lot
Yeah.
of options.
Yeah, my undergraduate, y'all, was in poetry. I'm a published poet. That was my background. So like you can I don't care where you're coming from, you can do cybersecurity. Like it is fun, it's always changing and any life experience you have is going to help.
Oh, yeah. We'll sort of bring it back to some of the questions, but I do think that was an important segue, very much so. So, how do you assess risk with AI technology?
Ooh, I'm so excited about this question. Okay, uh, so if we go back to the risk thing, right, the threat, vulnerability, and consequence, the way that you would look at risk from AI technology is the same way you would look at risk of anything. How does AI change the threat surface for good and ill, right? Could an AI become a threat actor, for example? We're concerned about power seeking behavior in AI, and that sounds sci fi, but it's really not, right? Like if we're making general purpose reasoning machines, one of the things that they might very readily figure out is that having like assets, having money, having like employees, whatever it is, might be beneficial. So they might be a threat actor, but then they also might make it easier for threat actors to be successful, right? You can imagine like a large language model might make it easier for someone who doesn't speak English to present a credible front for a social engineering campaign. So you look at the threat part, you figure out how that changes. You look at the vulnerability part, right? Like, does it make it easier for us to parse data logs so that we actually can see more of what's happening in the system? Sure, that's probably true. Does it also maybe introduce vulnerabilities? Like an AI might not see the same kinds of disturbance that a human monitor of a system might be able to see. Maybe. And then in terms of consequences, what consequences are there of using AI in different spaces? I gave a talk a while back about the ability of AI to unintentionally reify, so sort of reinforce biases that we already have, right? AI isn't the best answer. AI is the most average answer, right? Like that's how large language models work. They're not smarter than you, they just have done all the reading and they've synthesized the reading. So areas where you want big innovation, like AI can help you with that groundwork, but then the innovation part, right, is you probably want to not use whatever your average bear is thinking. Also, there are issues with hallucinations and things like that, right? Those might cause adverse consequences. We're working on those, so those are probably going to go down over time. But in general, that's how you think about it. So when people ask me, what do you think of AI? I'm like, that's like saying, what do I think about cars? Like, there's going to be good purposes for cars. There's going to be like people die in car accidents. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use cars, but also, like it changed the whole structure of the American city, so it is going to matter.
Oh, yeah. So next question is what is the best way of determining event likelihoods in terms of co-occurring events?
Okay, okay, okay. So this is really complicated. Um, like co-occurring events and likelihood. What we would generally do, okay, so this is a really technical question. I'm gonna get into the nerdy bits a little bit, okay? So the
Oh,
question
here
is
for let's go.
okay, so the question is whether or not you would treat these as exogenous or endogenous. So if the likelihoods are stacked, it's much more complicated. If they're separate, right, so the likelihood of you
Mhm.
being able to do A is independent of your likelihood to do B, right? So let's say my likelihood of being successful with a social engineering attack is 90%, right? We could say 100%, but okay, 90%. My likelihood of then being able to do a lateral move in the system, those aren't related, right? So I can just stack those together. I can multiply those. So 90% by 60%, and then I get that answer. If they are endogenous, though, so for instance, an example of that would be like the likelihood of me being able to do a social engineering attack and then be able to use a secondary social engineering attack to get escalation. Probably if I've done the first, that's an indication that I have skills. So when they're endogenous, when they're using the same skills, if the calculations get a little harder. You can do it with a BayesNet, like with a Bayesian approach, but it is more on the sort of mathy quantitative side of the yeah.
I'm so glad you got into the nitty-gritty. I love those questions. Um, and then, so this is going a little bit back to getting into cybersecurity and positions, but I'm curious on your, and so
Mhm.
is this question, is could you provide your perspective on the apparent paradox between the high competition for entry level, cybersecurity positions and the reported, industry-wide talent shortage? And if you would like to
Yes.
pass on this question, please let me know.
Oh no, I'm happy to talk about it. There are some things I'm not going to say, but if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I can say elsewhere. But I think there's a few things. One is that I do think that there is an unrealistic perspective in industry right now. Everybody
Mm.
wants an entry level job with 5 years of experience. Um, those aren't the same thing. Um, and I think that's very frustrating. That's why I think networking is important. The other thing is there is a fairly high sort of move around rate in cybersecurity, and so I think you do get some churn, and I think that makes it worse. Another thing that makes it worse, though, is that I think there's kind of a peanut butter approach that some companies have where they know they need more cyber. We need more cybersecurity, right? They don't really necessarily know what they need, and so they're posting jobs to solve problems that an entry-level job wouldn't necessarily solve, or they are and so they're seeking like, "Oh, well, I need you to be able to do X, Y, and Z," and when you can't do that in the interview, they're like, "Oh, well, why are you applying for this?" I said, "Well, because you posted an entry-level job." There used to be more on-the-job training in general across all fields. And so I think that that is something that it's a little bit it's not quite as bad in cyber, but I do think that that's a problem, and it's one of the reasons why being able to sort of even if you're doing capture the flag or whatever, just to be able to demonstrate some experience, even if it's not in that job role, can be helpful. But I definitely another thing is I used to tell this to my students because I used to teach a capstone, so like the end
Yeah.
um, of their college degree, was if you ask 100 people out on dates, you will probably get several dates, right? Like that's a very high rejection rate, 100 people, right? With jobs right now, because the barrier to application has gone down, if you apply to 100 jobs, you're probably on a good day only going to get 10 callbacks. And then for the interview phase, that same percentage comes in. So if you do 100 jobs, you may only get like you might get one, or you might get if you do 300, you might get so I mean it is a very high rejection rate compared to almost everything else in our lives. And if you are looking for a job right now, I really want you to hear that that is not something that you are doing wrong. The world is different. The application process is different. The HR sorting process is different. um, One thing that I will say I think AI is really, really good for is revising your cover letters and revising your resumes to align with a posted position. You're not making
Mm.
anything up, but a lot of times companies are using AI to parse the information that's coming in. So use AI to your benefit to make sure that it aligns well, and don't spend the heartache of like you painstakingly trying to do that yourself. If you are struggling to find an entry level, a mid level position, anything like that, please don't feel like that's because you suck, right? Like the system right now is really, really broken. We're thinking about like I'm in an organization that hires, right? We're thinking about ways to change it, but we understand that it's not working well for anybody right now. And I just want to be very clear that if you're experiencing that, please don't get discouraged or think cybersecurity isn't for you. It's like that for a lot of places. Network if you can, and just hang in there. And I'm sorry.
That was, great tips because it's hard. I wasn't always in this industry, and even applying for jobs, I applied for like 30 plus and only got like one interview. So it is not just this industry. So uh, stay positive. And then I think we're going to do one more question
Okay.
before we end out the webinar. But Google recently stated that ChatGPT was indeed being used in writing malware. So should the solution be ChatGPT monitoring and policing and curbing users that do this type of activity?
So that's a complicated question.
It is. This is a big one. I saved it for the end.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's a really good question. It's a really complicated question. I'm going to tell you some things that I know for certain that some of these companies do because I've worked with them and I've been on not professional. I've been on in important decision-making spaces with them talking about how we're going to use AI in the future. I've gotten to do some work with the State Department. I've gotten to do some work with them as part of I'm a non-resident fellow at University of Berkeley's
Mm,
UC Berkeley's Risk and Security Lab, and they so we talk about this a lot. And the heart of the question is um, what how much freedom do you restrict to use these tools? Because what can be used to develop malware can be used to defend against malware. They are doing many things already. So, for instance, if you're asking questions about self-harm, it will trigger a different response than just here's how you might hurt yourself. If you want to go talk to the president, it will give you a set of information about, like sort of reasonable and acceptable ways, and it'll be very cautious about those answers. If you want to make a bomb, like there's lots of things that they're already restricting. Malware's a little tricky, right? Because like most of malware is not the mal, it's just software. Um, so I know that they are actively engaged. They, Anthropic, Huggy Face, all of these different companies are really seriously considering these things. This is one of the areas where the sort of fail fast, like try everything, fail fast, whatever, is not how they're doing it. Like they've all got ethics boards. They're all really, really working hard. They're not perfect. ChatGPT has gotten some flack for a number of things, but I will say that in general, it has been my personal experience of these AI companies that they are thinking really hard about these questions. They may not come to the same conclusion that we would, but they're looking at a big picture because, for example, the same thing happens in bio, right? Like what allows you to make a new medicine could also allow you to make a new poison, and so they're having to be really thoughtful about the overall implication, not just the narrow use case.
wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Booth. I think we've all very much enjoyed it. And I do want to just re stress there's been a lot of just thank yous in here for the encouragement. I think applying for jobs is probably everyone's least favorite thing to do on the
It's so
planet.
hard.
And it can be so discouraging. So I think that just bit of encouragement really can help somebody's day. And I'm seeing it in the questions. So I just wanted to reiterate to you from everyone, thank you for that encouragement and guidance. Um, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. If you would like to connect with Dr. Booth, please feel free. She said she would be willing on LinkedIn. Remember to network, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much. Bye bye.